Putin's strategic gamble, Russian warships and nuclear submarine to Cuba. In the early days of June, a sudden and unexpected order from the Kremlin set off alarms across the world. Russian President Vladimir Putin, known for his strategic acumen and bold military decisions, had commanded a fleet of Russian warships, including a formidable nuclear submarine, to set sail for Cuba. This unprecedented move triggered a cascade of diplomatic, military, and political reactions, reminiscent of the Cold War era. The unexpected deployment was a calm, uneventful morning at the Severomorsk naval base when the order came through. Admiral Viktor Petrov, a seasoned and highly respected officer, was tasked with leading the mission. His orders were clear but surprising: navigate the fleet through the North Atlantic, past the Greenland-Iceland-UK Juke Gap, and make their way to the Caribbean, specifically to the waters off Cuba. The fleet comprised some of Russia's most advanced vessels. Among them were the missile cruiser Varyag, the destroyer Admiral Panteleiev, and the nuclear-powered submarine, the Belgorod. The inclusion of the Belgorod, a submarine capable of carrying Poseidon nuclear torpedoes, underscored the gravity of the deployment. As the fleet embarked on its journey, the international community began to take notice. Satellite images and naval tracking systems identified the movement, and soon, news of the deployment spread like wildfire. The Pentagon, NATO, and various intelligence agencies scrambled to understand Putin's motives and to predict the possible outcomes of this provocative action. The deployment to Cuba was not just a show of military might. It was a calculated geopolitical maneuver. Cuba, situated just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, has long held strategic significance. During the Cold War, the island was a focal point of tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, most notably during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Now, decades later, Cuba was once again in the spotlight. For Russia, Cuba offered a strategic outpost close to the United States. By deploying warships and a nuclear submarine to Cuba, Putin was sending a clear message: Russia was prepared to challenge U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere and was capable of projecting power far beyond its borders. The move also solidified the long-standing alliance between Russia and Cuba, with Havana welcoming the Russian presence as a counterbalance to U.S. influence in the region. The global reaction as the Russian fleet neared Cuban waters, the world watched with bated breath. The deployment had immediate ramifications, both regionally and globally. In Washington, the mood was one of apprehension and urgency. President James Mitchell convened an emergency meeting with his top national security advisors. The Situation Room buzzed with activity as intelligence reports poured in and military options were debated. Secretary of Defense Emily Hughes was among the first to voice her concerns. "This is a direct challenge to our national security," she stated. "We need to respond swiftly and decisively." The Joint Chiefs of Staff echoed her sentiments, outlining potential countermeasures that included increasing naval patrols in the Caribbean, deploying additional forces to Guantanamo Bay, and enhancing surveillance of the Russian fleet. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels were abuzz. The U.S. State Department issued a formal protest to the Russian government, demanding an explanation for the deployment. Allies and partners in NATO were briefed and consulted. There was a consensus that the situation required a coordinated response to deter further Russian provocations. In Moscow, the Kremlin maintained a resolute stance. Putin, addressing the State Duma, justified the deployment as a defensive measure. "We are merely ensuring the security of our allies and protecting our national interests," he declared. Russian state media echoed this narrative, portraying the deployment as a necessary response to NATO's increased presence near Russia's borders. The Cuban perspective in Havana, the arrival of the Russian fleet was met with a mix of excitement and anxiety. President Alejandro Martinez, who had been cultivating closer ties with Moscow, welcomed the Russian ships with a grand ceremony at the port of Mariel. The Cuban government viewed the deployment as a reaffirmation of its strategic partnership with Russia and a potential boost to its own national security. However, not everyone in Cuba was enthusiastic. Among the Cuban populace, there were concerns about the potential repercussions of hosting such a formidable foreign military presence. Rising tensions as the Russian fleet settled into its positions near Cuba, tensions continued to rise. In Washington, the decision was made to deploy a carrier strike group to the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford, one of the U.S. Navy's most advanced aircraft carriers, set sail from Norfolk, Virginia, accompanied by a fleet of destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. This show of force was intended to send a clear message to Moscow: the United States was prepared to defend its interests and allies in the Western Hemisphere. The presence of both Russian and American naval forces in close proximity created a highly volatile situation. Incidents of close encounters and aggressive maneuvers became frequent. There were reports of Russian and American aircraft shadowing each other, and on one occasion, a Russian frigate and an American destroyer came perilously close to colliding. Diplomatic efforts to defuse the situation intensified. The United Nations called for restraint and dialogue, urging both sides to avoid actions that could escalate into open conflict. Behind the scenes, diplomats from various countries worked tirelessly to mediate between Washington and Moscow. The international community deployment of the Russian fleet to Cuba had significant implications for the international community. NATO convened an emergency summit in Brussels to discuss the situation and to formulate a collective response. The alliance reaffirmed its commitment to the defense of its member states and to maintaining stability in the Caribbean. China, observing the unfolding events with keen interest, saw an opportunity to expand its influence. Beijing offered to mediate between the U.S. and Russia, positioning itself as a neutral party capable of brokering a peaceful resolution. This move was part of a broader strategy to enhance China's role as a global peacemaker and to challenge the traditional dominance of the U.S. and Russia in international affairs. In Latin America, reactions were mixed. Some countries, like Venezuela and Nicaragua, openly supported Russia's actions, viewing them as a counterbalance to U.S. influence in the region. Others, like Brazil and Argentina, expressed concern over the potential for conflict and the destabilizing effects it could have on regional security. Despite diplomatic efforts, the situation continued to deteriorate. In late July, an incident occurred that brought the world to the brink of war. During a routine patrol, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft was intercepted by Russian Su-35 fighter jets over the Caribbean Sea. The encounter quickly escalated, with both sides accusing the other of aggressive behavior. The U.S. aircraft was forced to take evasive action, narrowly avoiding a collision. The incident sparked a flurry of activity in Washington and Moscow. President Mitchell, addressing the nation, condemned the Russian actions and announced a series of economic sanctions against Russia. In response, Putin declared that any further provocations would be met with decisive military action. The international community reacted with alarm. The United Nations Security Council held an emergency session, and world leaders called for immediate de-escalation. Behind closed doors, negotiations intensified, with diplomats working around the clock to prevent a full-scale conflict. The turning point amidst the rising tensions, a breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Pope Francis, leveraging his moral authority and diplomatic connections, offered to mediate between the U.S. and Russia. The Vatican's neutral stance and the Pope's personal commitment to peace provided a glimmer of hope. After intense negotiations, both sides agreed to a temporary de-escalation. A summit was arranged in Geneva, where President Mitchell and President Putin would meet face-to-face for the first time since the crisis began. The stakes were high, and the world watched anxiously as the leaders arrived in Switzerland. The summit was tense and fraught with challenges, but it marked a turning point. Both leaders, recognizing the catastrophic consequences of a military conflict, committed to finding a diplomatic solution. They agreed to a series of confidence-building measures, including mutual reductions in naval deployments and the establishment of a direct communication link to prevent future incidents. The aftermath of the Geneva summit was a success, but it was just the beginning of a long and complex process of de-escalation. Over the following months, the U.S. and Russia engaged in a series of negotiations to address the underlying issues that had led to the crisis. These talks covered a wide range of topics, from arms control and military transparency to regional security and economic cooperation. In Cuba, the presence of the Russian fleet gradually diminished. The nuclear submarine Belgorod departed first, followed by the other warships. While some Russian military personnel remained, the scale of the deployment was significantly reduced. This was part of a broader agreement to ease tensions and restore stability in the Caribbean. The international community played a crucial role in supporting the de-escalation efforts. NATO and the European Union endorsed the agreements reached in Geneva, and countries in Latin America worked to strengthen regional security mechanisms. China, having played a significant role as